Hey everybody, Luke McElroy from METS Performance Consulting, back with another episode of the Physiology Secrets podcast. Joined today with Nick Jane Koskis. Today we're just going to answer a question which has been in the METS Mastermind group for quite some time. We did answer it privately, but we wanted to put it out publicly because this question does come up quite frequently. Nick, can you go through the question?
Yeah, so the question was, often see mixed reviews, research or opinions on big gear threshold efforts. So the example given here is like 6 by 6 minutes at 100% of your FTP at about 70, cadence of 70 RPM. With 3 minutes easy spinning recovery, about 60% of FTP at 90 RPM. Some of the research says that those intervals, or those types of intervals, big gear work has no real benefit, and then other sources are sort of saying that 40k time trial type performance is something that could be improved by it. So really the question I'm asking, like, what's the go with big gear training, or I guess the opposite end of the spectrum as well with high cadence training? How's it all fit in?
Yeah, I guess it sort of comes down to, again, always understanding what the goal of your session is. I know a lot of people, they sort of use this as like a strength endurance session, which I'm not a big fan of. If you want to do your strength, do it heavy in the gym. If you want to do your endurance, do it at the optimal force velocity curve, which we'll talk about shortly. You can do it. Look, there's a crossover. It's going to work for most people. Once you get to that higher level of fitness and strength, it's going to have limited benefit. But if people are time poor, they enjoy doing it on the bike, it's better for adherence, then yes, it's going to work pretty well. But there are better ways for your strength endurance, or your strength and endurance probably shouldn't really go together, kind of opposite things. But so you can be worth. In terms of I'm trying to think what I've seen in oxygen consumption. I'm not sure if you've seen it. You'd think that lower cadence would have higher. I feel lower cadence should have higher oxygen consumption. But I actually think the research shows that lower cadence has lower oxygen consumption. Well, my thinking was that if you've got lower cadence, you're probably going to be rocking left and right and unnecessarily clenched in the hands and using extra muscles, and therefore have higher oxygen consumption. But I actually think I'm talking small amounts, but the research is showing that lower cadence actually has slightly lower oxygen consumption. Have you read anything about that?
I read it specifically, but something they're talking about in triathlon now is quite often a lot of people traditionally sort of went, if we have a really high cadence, it's going to help us run off the bike better, but lower cadence is starting to be the way to go, which might be coming down to an oxygen consumption thing. Is it more economical to just be consistently just ticking the pedals over as opposed to almost overspinning? Might be coming down to an economy thing.
I'm talking small amounts.
But
I don't think
it's massive, because you still see quite a big variance. This is where we can head with force velocity.
Yeah.
See a big variance of riders who are typically really high cadence compared to some who much prefer to sit at 70 RPM or 60 RPM at an effort, but they're both putting out the same amount of power.
Yeah, see, I know that if I'm doing a sprint, I'll hit my peak power at somewhere between 140 and 150 RPM. That's like a max effort sprint, trying to hit 2,000 watts or whatever I'm trying to hit. And then also when I used to race crits competitively, I'd sit around 100 to 110 through a crit race. But now if I go out for a ride, even if I'm pushing pretty hard, go up the 1 in 20 as hard as I can, I'm sitting at about 80, 85 RPM. So I notice that the more trained I am personally, the higher my optimal cadence is. And then the less trained, the lower it is. So do you just want to roll through what is force velocity and how it applies to cycling cadence?
Yeah, so pretty much everything from a power perspective is governed by this force velocity curve, or the relationship between force and velocity. So your wattage on the bike is made up of basically the cadence and then how hard you're turning the pedals, essentially. So the torque that's going around the pedal or through the bottom bracket. You can put out a really high amount of force if you're stationary on the bike, basically not moving in the hardest gear possible, and you turn the pedals once. It takes a lot of force to do that, but you do it at a very slow velocity. The other end of the spectrum, if you're rolling down a hill and you're getting the lightest possible gear and you just spin as fast as you can, you can get your cadence up to 100, 150, 140, whatever you can get to, but you're not going to be putting a lot of force through the pedals. So it's really the faster you spin the pedals, the less force you can put in, and the slower you spin the pedals, the more force you can put in, is a simple way of putting it. But there is this balance point in the middle where it's basically everyone's got this optimal point based on your genetics and your muscle fiber type makeup of you more slow twitch, more fast twitch, where you're going to put the best amount of power out at a particular cadence gearing ratio that's going to give you, I guess, that optimal performance that you can just sit on. Talking about your example before, you go when you feel like you're more trained, and something we've spoken before with like 2,000 watts, why can you get there? Is probably you're a heavy, fast twitch fibre person anyway. You're going to be more on that just explosive, rapid end of the spectrum. So you're able to get that cadence going because you can produce those contractions really, really quickly and explosively, get up to a cadence of 140, 150 in a sprint, no issues, compared to if we take your ultimate endurance athlete, long distance specialist, slow twitch fibre type, they might hit their peak power at a cadence of 90 and they can't spin much faster because their body just can't produce that explosive action to pedal really quickly. As a result, even though they've turned the pedals hard because the cadence isn't up there, they're not able to get the top end power up. So it's a balance between force and
yeah, it's trying to find that optimum. It's kind of like you want to, at the risk of oversimplifying, it's almost you want to have your cadence as high as possible whilst maximising tension throughout the whole cycle. You need to be able to produce the force at the same time. So again, really simply, you could be pedaling if you push, let's say, 1 kilogram of force at an RPM of 100, you're at 100 watts, for example, versus 10 kilograms of force at 10 RPM is still 100. 10 times 10 is 100. 100 times by whatever I said. It's the same wattage.
It's the same wattage, yeah.
You can either produce more force slowly or less force quickly and potentially get the same wattage. So you need to find what the optimum is for you. Now, obviously, if you're pedaling like a 50 RPM and grinding, you can imagine, as I said before, just picture in your head, you're going to be wobbling. It's not going to be optimal. You're going to have dead spots because, look, your quads are stronger than your hamstrings. You'll be able to push more than you can pull. You've got to find that even torque through the pedal. And then on the flip side, if you're going to go pedal it, if you're used to doing 90 or 100 and you go try to do 180 RPM, I think the fastest I could ever get to about 185. I know some sprinters can get to like 200.
Ridiculous.
So if you're going to try and go pedal at 180 revolutions per minute, it's going to be extremely...
really quick.
Yeah.
You're not going to have much tension on the pedals at all.
Exactly. You're not going to hold the tension throughout. You're not going to have an even pedal stroke. So in terms of the optimum for you, it's going to vary... depending on what you do. As I said, the lower the intensity for me, the lower my cadence, because I don't have to if I'm only pushing at 250 watts, I don't have to be at 110 because I can produce plenty of force at 90 RPM to hit 250 versus I'm racing doing a crit and I'm trying to accelerate out of the corner. Anyone who's done crit racing, you go into a corner, if you break into the corner and you're in a reasonably big gear, because maybe you're going 40, 45 and then you come out of a corner going 20, it's hard. You get dropped off. If you don't gear down, you get dropped off because now you've got to produce a lot of force at a lower cadence and it's not effective in terms of that force velocity profile. So you either need to fly into the corner or maybe gear down twice because the optimum for you to accelerate back up more quickly is a lower resistance and a quicker speed. So you're going to want to basically, as I said before, find out what the optimum is for you in terms of being able to maintain the tension of the crank throughout the whole movement. And whatever speed RPM that occurs at, whether that be 90, 100, 110, some people 120 maybe, you probably haven't seen much above that, at least for prolonged time trials. It's going to be very, very dependent on you. But in terms of like a training tool, so doing it for, and I know it's a little bit vague in terms of what happens here, but for 40k time trial, so it's 6 by 6 minute efforts at your functional threshold at a low gear. Do you see any benefit in that, or is it... Is that sort of more of a strength training?
I think the interesting thing that we need to look at if we're looking at 40k time trial performance being improved because of doing big gear, if we're seeing an improved result, I would put that down typically to what your individual force velocity profile looks like. Are you more of that able to produce force really quickly, or are you able to produce a lot of force, and which end do you fall? So like a simple test you can do is like a 5-second sprint on a bike, if you've got a power meter, of course. 5-second sprint, flat out, slight downhill if you can to get yourself moving. But you want to be starting as close as possible to a stationary start and then just go as hard as you can for 5 seconds. What you'll see is your maximum cadence in that time. And typically guys who can get up to 120, 130, 140 in that time will be more of that ability to get the cadence going, that high velocity. May actually find that you working on the big gear stuff might help them. It depends on what gearing you're starting, but you need to start on something that's reasonably sort of, when I say moderate to heavy under your feet, if that makes sense. But if you find that you can't get the cadence going, you're at 80, 90 cadence at the end of that 5 seconds, we probably need to work on some of the higher cadence stuff. So I'd probably find, if you did a study into 40k time trial performance and took a whole bunch of athletes who had issues with producing lots of force, but they're really good at producing the velocity, so the cadence, and then had a group of athletes who did the opposite, and you gave them those two groups different training interventions. So the group that could produce lots of force got high velocity stuff, so low gear, really fast spinning. They gave the other group big gear, low cadence, so basically just working on their weakness essentially, they all start to improve time trial performance, because when they can then choose their cadence and choose their gear ratio to sit on that optimal, that's where you're going to be producing your best performance for a 40k time trial. But it's the type of thing, all we've done in the training is just work on the weaker part of our overall performance and weaker part of that force velocity perspective, and then it's just brought everything back into the middle.
Yeah. So I think sort of summarise what you said there in terms of performance enhancement. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, and I've read 90 to 100 is about the standard for most people, being the optimum cadence, but it's going to vary to person. So you'd almost need to do, I'm trying to think of a protocol, not something we standardise, but a protocol on the go where maybe you do a 10-minute, maybe a 10-minute effort, and you just play around with different cadences. You do 70 and then you do complete recovery. Next 2 days later you do 80 and then you do 90 and then you actually hold 100. Just go balls out as hard as you can, see what your average power is and your rating of perceived exertion and all the rest. This is obviously isolated just to cycling. We're not talking about running off the bike and different muscular fatigue issues you might have on there. But basically testing that out, and there's no doubt in my mind I've done it, and this isn't even from a scientific point of view, this is just from when I raced, when I didn't race. If I want to increase my cadence, and because I found that 100 to 110 was better, I just had to do efforts at that. So I just do really low resistance and get up to, like, again, it's hard as you can. It's all either really hard or really easy, right? So it's hard as you can, 160, 170, 180 to low cadence, and that just made me more comfortable with that 100 to 110. So you don't have to bring it up, but if you wanted, if after you did some testing and you decided, hey, look, actually at 100 I've got a better power output at a lower rating of perceived exertion, but normally I'm only at 80 and you've got to bring it up, then you've got to do that higher cadence stuff, and vice versa. If you find that actually, you know what, I'm functioning better at 80 than I was at 100, then maybe you can do the slightly more heavy resistance, 70 RPM work, to bring it down. And it's going to be, again, a training tool, whether it's low or high cadence, to bring up or come down depending on what your optimum is. I think from a strength endurance perspective, I think we're both in agreement that, hey, you can do it as a secondary thing, but it is better to do your strength work in the gym. But there's a time and place. If you're fresh, 6-minute efforts is going to be pretty much sub-max, because it's even not the FTP, it's sub-max. But if you were to do full recovery, 2-3 minutes recovery, and then go really hard for 5, 10, 15 seconds, that's going to be really good. You'll stimulate the right fibres and grow and adapt that way. But if you're going to do a prolonged effort at a lower cadence, at the end of the day, it's going to be the same power output. It's still going to be a sub-max power output, 300 watts, but your max is 1,000. It's still a sub-max workload, so it's probably not the best strength tool, but something better than nothing, and that would be the next best alternative. Yeah,
and like I said, you just got to think about what the adaptation or the purpose of the session is. If the purpose of the session is, I'm doing a big gear session because I'm trying to get stronger quads to be able to put more force on the pedals, like just go on leg press or squat heavy, or single leg squat or Bulgarian split squat or whatever you want to do, because that's just a more controlled way of loading up the muscles, getting the same stimulus, the same adaptation. I'd rather save the bike sessions for the specific stuff and go, all right, I'm going to do my 6x6 minute efforts at FTP at my optimal cadence, because that is the most specific way to train for my 40k time trial, as opposed to jumping on the bike and doing lots of really big gear stuff. Be interesting to see. There's some of the studies that were sort of being referred to in the question. It's like, were any of those athletes doing anything other than just being on the bike? If not, then the session's probably working, because it's substituting for their strength session off the bike. But if they were doing strength off the bike, are we kind of doubling up and just, again, when we talk about time poor athletes and not being able to do a lot of things, maybe at the moment with not much access to gyms, if you don't have a home gym, maybe it's a decent alternative for now. But when everything sort of reopens, is the type of thing that you're better off spending your time in a gym. I'd probably say yes. For the big gear stuff, do the quality strength work in the gym, then transition it to the bike and focus on the optimal output, because that's specificity.
And don't get me wrong, I prescribe on the bike strength all the time, but I don't do it for 6 minutes continuously. I do it. It's ATP PC, so it's probably a 10-second block. It's either really low cadence, really low gear and high cadence, or it might be stationary, high gear and really low cadence but really high force. But my point being is, I'm not holding 300 watts, I'm trying to hold 2,000 watts and make it maximal intensity, whereas a 6-minute effort is kind of like, well, you're getting a little bit of strength but not as much as doing what I just said before, and then it's kind of doubling up as cardio, and it's a bit of a mixture, and we're not really big on the mixture. You're better off doing one or the other.
And are we putting ourselves at risk of something like an injury? I know, like, as we said before, you drop the cadence down. Does that make you rock a bit more on the bike? For most people who have a reasonable bike fit, but there's probably still some tweaks and stuff you can make, or if you've done it yourself and haven't had it assessed or whatever, if you're starting to rock a bit more, does that cause issues in your lower back? Does it cause issues through your knees because you're just trying to push the pedals with a lot more force? It's going to obviously fatigue you a lot more than doing an optimal cadence session, I would think, because you're just having to exert more force into the pedals each pedal stroke. So you go riding up a hill in a heavy gear and try to do it all the way up. It's tough.
Yeah.
Like, it's not as easy as sitting your optimal, or if you try and sit down the entire way up the hill, they get up out of the saddle. It's that, I look at it in that type of perspective. So are you running into more issues than what you need to be? Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the last consideration, and I'll bring it up because we know Brent is a triathlete, is running off the bike. You know, again, it's going to be an individual thing. I personally know that for me, higher cadence, lower resistance is better for me running off the bike. And I guess it's kind of one of those things. We know that using a triathlon or a time trial bike reduces the neuromuscular transition more than a road bike, because you're in more hip extension, using more glutes and muscles at the back of your legs. You're able to transition into running better. I find it's a similar way in terms of having a higher cadence, given that you're going to be running it, for me, at a low cadence, but it's still 165 steps a minute. So if I go from 100 to 110 revolutions per minute on the bike to 160 steps, that's a lesser transition than holding a 70 RPM cadence and then all of a sudden having to triple that almost, that double and a half. To get to 165. And also I just find that my legs are heavy if I hold whether I got the 1 in 20, whatever it is, I'm holding 70, 80, 85 cadence, my legs are pretty tired at the end, versus if I can keep on top of spinning at 100, 110. Personally I hold more power anyway, but I find that the less strain on my legs, the better coming the run. But I know a lot of people, and it's quite a big thing, that they do a lower cadence, so it just depends on what you want.
It's the type of thing, is there something in, maybe if you're spinning at a really high cadence at the back, even towards the back end of the bike, and then you come off and you've got a relatively low cadence when you run, if that's your natural rhythm, is that where the impacting factor is? I'm just thinking through potential options of what's going on. It's like if you have a really sort of, I guess, moderate cadence on the bike, you're sitting at 80 or 90, then you jump off the bike, you start running at a pretty sort of moderate cadence. You don't necessarily try to turn your feet over too quick. Are you then keeping things quite consistent in terms of what your body's outputting potentially? That's probably where I see maybe a cadence of like 100, 110 if you're spinning really quick, and then you jump off and you start running, you've got a decent stride length and you're just sort of this like more consistent. Are you going from trying to spin really fast to now trying to run at a cadence that's slow? I know we're talking different variables, but maybe that's where some athletes having issues, and dropping the cadence a bit on the bike might be causing it. I know I sit at a little bit lower cadence. I think I sit like 80, 85 probably is where I'm more comfortable. And then have no issues getting off the bike. So lower cadence, slightly big here, but it just depends on, everyone's individual. It really comes down to that, I guess, that fibre type mix as well. I'm probably, compared to what you're like, you're a really fast switch, I'm probably more that sort of bit of fast, bit of slow. If we took someone who was that really slow switch fibre, they're probably a little bit lower than what I am as well. Maybe 80 cadence on the bike or whatever. You're more comfortable for a longer course race if we're talking triathlon. Yeah,
and again, I think just as you said there, I think the duration is really important as well. I'll definitely hold a higher cadence on a sprint or Olympic compared to a 70.3, for example. And you see that particularly on the longer course, the full distance Ironman, a lot of everyone is starting to do really low cadence, like 60 RPM. And again, that could come back to, most of the research is suggesting that lower cadence has slightly less oxygen consumption, then you're going to just save energy, and that's going to be beneficial at the back end of the race. So, versus having a higher cadence, which potentially could use more fast twitch, because you literally have to contract the muscle a bit quicker, not necessarily more force, but just quicker. So again, it's that genetic variance that's going to change for everybody. So I think in summary for today, in terms of doing low cadence work, again, know what you're doing. If you figure out what your optimum is, go find a hill, whatever it is, do it something around about a 6 to 10 minute time trial. This is just off the top of our heads. It should work. Go as hard as you can, 70 RPM, 80, 90, 100, close enough. See what comes out as the best average power output and rating of set exertion for you. If you're normally higher than that, then you're going to want to do some heavy gear stuff to get used to it. And if you're normally lower than that, you do some light gear, high cadence stuff. And just be aware that it's not a one size fits all. You're going to have to play around with it. If you're just riding a bike, it's reasonably simple. If you've got to run off the bike as well, then you've got to figure out how you feel with that neuromuscular transition coming off the bike. But have a play around. Again, don't get too scientific about it. We know that generally speaking, it's a little bit less oxygen the lower the cadence, but there's a whole lot of other issues that come with it as well. If you're doing it for strength benefits, strength generally in the gym, or doing it when you're fresh on the bike, 10-15 seconds flat
Short
out,
burst,
have your proper recovery, do it again. Always just keep it as specific as you can. But at the end of the day, something is better than nothing. If you're not going to go to the gym and you're only going to do it on the bike, oh well, better than not doing it at all. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that was useful, and we'll speak to you again on the next episode.